Coach Frank Bellman had cut exactly one kid in his 11 years running the Meridian Middle School basketball program whose face he could still summon without effort. And it wasn't because the kid had been bad. It was because of the shoes. They were basketball shoes. Technically, the sole had separated from the upper on the left one sometime in October. And the kid, a wiry 14-year-old named Tyrell Banks, had wrapped a strip of silver duct tape around the toe to hold it together rather than tell anyone he needed new ones. Frank remembered the sound those shoes made on the gym floor, a faint sticky peel with every stride, and remembered thinking, in the quick, unexamined way coaches make cuts under time pressure with 40 kids and 12 roster spots, that a kid who couldn't keep his equipment together probably couldn't keep his commitment together either. Tyrell had also missed 4 of the 12 tryout sessions that November, which mattered more to Frank than the shoes did, and which Frank had never bothered to ask about, because 40 kids in 2 weeks doesn't leave much room for asking. He posted the roster on the gym door on a Friday afternoon. Tyrell's name wasn't on it. Frank found out 8 years later, purely by accident, exactly why Tyrell had missed those sessions. And by then, the finding out cost him considerably more than the asking would have. "You've got good hands, kid," Frank had told him that day, not unkindly, in the tone coaches use when they've already decided something and are dressing the decision in encouragement. "Work on your consistency. Try again next year." Tyrell had nodded, picked up a duffel bag with a broken zipper, and walked out of the gym without arguing, the way a 14-year-old walks when arguing has never once, in his experience, changed an adult's mind about anything. Before we find out what happened 10 years later on a different gym floor, in a different town, we need a minute to understand what Frank Bellman didn't know standing at that roster sheet, and what Tyrell Banks built out of the 10 years that followed. Tyrell Banks was 24 years old now, and for the past 3 years he had run Riverside Youth Athletics, a community sports program in a neighboring town that served roughly 140 kids across 3 age brackets, funded through a patchwork of grants, a modest annual fundraiser, and Tyrell's own salary, which he'd voluntarily kept at $38,000 a year, so more of the budget could go toward gear, gym time, and travel costs for families who couldn't cover them. He had missed those 4 tryout sessions a decade earlier because his mother worked the overnight shift at a regional distribution center, and someone needed to walk his 2 younger siblings home from elementary school and get them fed before she left for work. And there had been, in the fall Tyrell turned 14, exactly no one else available to do it. He had never told Coach Bellman this, because it had not once occurred to 14-year-old Tyrell that an adult in charge of a roster might actually want the explanation, rather than simply the outcome. Being cut had cost him more than a season of basketball. It had cost him, for almost 2 years afterward, the belief that effort mattered if the people evaluating it never bothered to look past the surface of a situation. He'd found his way back to the game at 16 through a rec league with looser rules and no cuts, had played 2 years of junior college ball on a partial scholarship, and had built Riverside Youth Athletics. When he finally had the standing to build anything around a single rule he'd carved into the program's mission statement himself: no kid gets turned away for what's in their closet or what's happening at home. If a kid needed shoes, the program had a donation closet. If a kid missed practice for a reason that mattered, an assistant coach called the family before anyone assumed anything. Frank Bellman's son. Ryan was 14 years old. Now, the same age Tyrell had been the day he was cut. And Frank had moved the family to Riverside 8 months earlier for a job transfer, enrolling Ryan in the town's only competitive youth basketball program because it was the closest thing to the tradition Frank had built his own identity around for 2 decades. Frank showed up to the first parent orientation meeting, expecting to shake hands with whatever assistant coach ran the drills. He did not expect the head coach standing at the front of the gym, clipboard in hand, whistle around his neck, to be a face he half recognized before he could place why. "Coach Banks," the man said, extending a hand to the room generally. "Good to have you all here. We run a tight program, but every kid who shows up ready to work gets a real shot, regardless of what's going on outside these walls. That's the only rule that actually matters here." Frank shook his hand along with the other parents, said something forgettable, and did not connect the name until 3 weeks later, watching Tyrell run a tryout session for the incoming group of 14-year-olds. Patient in a way Frank recognized as deliberate, stopping the whole drill line to ask a kid in visibly worn shoes whether he needed anything from the equipment closet before continuing. No judgment in his voice at all, just a logistics question asked the way you'd ask someone if they needed water. "Before we continue, if you believe that a 30-second judgment can cost a decade, and that the people we dismiss too quickly are often the ones who become exactly what we failed to see, please like this video, subscribe to Kindness Dailies, and share this with someone who needs to believe in people again today." Frank stood at the edge of that gym and felt something shift loose in his memory. The peeling sound of duct tape on a hardwood floor, a roster sheet, a kid with a broken duffel bag zipper walking out without arguing. He watched Tyrell Banks run the rest of the session with the clarity Frank hadn't managed at the same age in his own career, and by the end of it he was almost certain, and deeply unsettled by how certain he was. He waited until the gym had mostly cleared out. "Coach Banks, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Did you play middle school ball at Meridian?" "About 10 years back." Tyrell went still for a moment, the particular stillness of a man deciding whether a conversation is worth having honestly. "I tried out. Didn't make the team." "Duct tape on your shoes," Frank said quietly, more to himself than to Tyrell. "I cut you." "You did," Tyrell said. No anger in it, just a plain confirmation of a fact he had clearly made peace with a long time ago in his own way, on his own schedule. Frank stood there in the empty gym with his son's gear bag still slung over his shoulder, and felt the specific total weight of a decision he'd made in 30 seconds a decade earlier. A decision he had never once revisited because nothing had ever forced him to. "I cut you for missing sessions. I never asked why. I was walking my little brother and sister home from school. My mom worked nights." Tyrell said it evenly, without performance, the way he'd learned to say most things about that year. "I didn't think it was something a coach wanted explained. I just figured the roster was the roster." "It shouldn't have been," Frank said. "I built a rule in my head that a kid who couldn't keep his shoes together couldn't keep his commitment together. and I never once bothered to check if that rule was actually true. It wasn't true. I'm sorry. 10 years late, but I mean it. Tyrell studied him for a long moment. You built this program on that same rule, though. No exceptions for what's in a kid's closet. He gestured toward the equipment closet at the far end of the gym. I built mine on the opposite one. I think about that gym floor more than you'd probably guess. Not with anger anymore. Just, it's why the closet's there. My son's going to be coached by you, Frank said. I want you to know I understand what that means, given the history. If it's uncomfortable for you, I'll pull him from the program. I won't take it personally. Tyra looked past Frank, toward the gym doors where Ryan was waiting, gear bag over his shoulder. Patient the way a kid waits when he doesn't yet know an adult conversation is about him. Your son's got good hands, Tyrell said. Better footwork than most 14-year-olds I've seen come through here. I'd like to keep coaching him, if that's all right with you. Doesn't have anything to do with what happened between us. That's a different scoreboard. Frank drove home that night and told Ryan the whole story, not to teach him a lesson exactly, but because he'd decided, somewhere in that gym, that the version of himself who quietly carried a mistake for 10 years, without ever naming it out loud, was not the version he wanted his son learning from. Ryan asked, the way 14-year-olds ask the most useful questions without meaning to. So what did you do about it? What Frank did over the following season was become the equipment closet's quietest and most consistent donor, covering shoes and gear for any Riverside Youth Athletics kid who needed them, on the condition, his only condition, that no child or parent ever be told where the donations came from. He also showed up most Saturdays to help run drills as an unpaid assistant, not because Tyrell needed the help exactly, but because it was, Frank had come to understand, the only kind of apology that actually meant something a decade after the moment that required it. Ryan made the team, on his own merit, wearing shoes that fit properly, coached by a man his father had once dismissed in 30 seconds for a torn 1 dot. If this story moved you, please like this video, leave a comment, and share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Subscribe to Kindness Tales for more stories of courage, grace, and the small human moments that change everything. And tell us in the comments, is there a decision you made in 30 seconds that you'd take back 10 years later if you could?